Yo, what is going on, Headliner Nation? We've got some breaking news in the NFL. Well, not really breaking anymore. Unfortunately, your boy was all tied up today with work, so I couldn't get to this video until later on. But we have got an injury that is significantly going to alter the way that we look at the Jacksonville Jaguars this season. Travis Etienne, done for the year, out with a Liz Frank injury. What does that mean for this team going forward? Well, it means quite a bit. Most significantly, it's going to impact my boy, James Robinson. Now, unfortunately, I've had to be lower on James Robinson this offseason because we knew Travis Etienne was going to get a bunch of touches. You don't use a first-round pick on a running back and then not use him unless you're the Seattle Seahawks. But regardless of that fact, we knew Travis Etienne was going to get a bunch of touches, which was going to hurt the volume that James Robinson saw last season. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. But first and foremost, I got to bring my boy, Dr. Ethan Turner, in because we need to hear from him. What exactly is the Liz Frank injury? What does it mean for Travis Etienne? And what's the lookout? So Dr. Ethan Turner, take it away. Let's hear from you first.
Hey, what's going on, guys? Dr. Turner here again with the Fantasy Headliners. Let's give you a little bit of an update on this Travis Etienne injury, a little bit more knowledge on it. Let's talk first about just what a Liz Frank injury is. So Liz Frank injury is when the midfoot or the metatarsal bones shift and actually dislocate off of the tarsal bones, which are the large bones underneath the long bones. And when this happens, it can sometimes happen with a fracture. Sometimes it is just dislocated. In the case of Travis Etienne, this was just a dislocation. His x-rays were actually normal, but he did have significant dislocation, which means that he's going to have to opt for surgery. So typically with a Liz Frank injury, the surgery involves actually going in and securing the bones in place so that the ligaments have time to heal correctly. They will use screws, they'll use plates, sometimes they'll use wires. What it means though is that this is a pretty intense surgery. It does take quite a long time to heal. Sometimes they need a second surgery to actually remove all this hardware, which is why the normal recovery time for this type of an injury is 4 to 6 months, sometimes even longer, as players try to get back into playing shape after being off of their foot for so long. So again, with Travis Etienne, he has opted for surgery. He will have some type of hardware placed. Sometimes they'll need a second surgery to actually remove that hardware, but what it means is we will not see him in 2021. That being said, I do expect Travis Etienne to make his return next season. So for Dynasty, you want to make sure you're holding on to him. You don't want to sell him low because of this injury. He had a relatively clear injury history prior to this, so there is a good chance that this was just a fluke type of injury. It's not some type of repetitive issue that you're going to have to worry about. It does increase his risk going forward, so there is a chance that he has more foot issues because of this, but he's still young, he's still very explosive, and I expect him to return to 100% for 2022.
All right, appreciate Ethan sending me that video so I could put it in here for everybody. Now let's talk about what this means from a fantasy football perspective for everybody. Well, again, I already said this is going to impact James Robinson the most. James Robinson, just to remind you of his stats last year, he played in 14 games, 240 rushing attempts, and ran for 1,000 yards. He also had 49 receptions, 344 receiving yards, and 10 total touchdowns. Really, the season came out of nowhere for a lot of people, right? But if you remember, if you were a member of our MVP Patreon last year, I wrote about James Robinson in May, and I told everybody that if Leonard Fournette is traded or released, James Robinson is going to take over this backfield, and he will be a fantasy football guy that you have to have this season. So, of course, when they decided to use a first-round pick on Travis Etienne this offseason, when I really didn't think they needed to, it hurt because James Robinson was so good last season, right? Now, did the pick make sense? It made sense for what Urban Meyer wants to do and likes to do in this offense. I understood the pick, and my hope is that Travis Etienne and James Robinson could coexist together. But now, a lot of those touches that James Robinson was going to be missing out on are completely up for grabs because Etienne is done for the season. So Robinson, once again, is going to end up being the bell cow. But what does that mean? Well, first and foremost, it means that I've moved him in my rankings all the way up to a high RB2. Am I going to go to RB1 with him? No, I am not. The reason for that being is because I think this also helps Laviska Shenault Jr. I think that some of those short passing attempts or some of those opportunities we were going to see go to Travis Etienne aren't necessarily going to go to James Robinson. Those 49 receptions from last year, I see those going down. I could see those 49 receptions coming more along the lines of maybe 30 to 35 potentially, and possibly losing out on some of those receiving touchdowns that he had and some of the receiving yards. I'm also worried that we're going to see the rushing yards come down a little bit more as well. The offensive line in Jacksonville still isn't great by any means. It's not the worst in the National Football League, but it isn't great. And they drafted Trevor Lawrence for a reason. They're going to throw the football. They're going to throw it a lot. And they brought in Marvin Jones to really help the passing game as well. The defense isn't really that much better than it was last season. It's still a very poor defense that's going to give up a lot of points, which means Jacksonville is going to have to throw the ball a lot. Now, can James Robinson still get about 200 rushing attempts? I believe so. But that could, again, bring those rushing yards down, maybe put them more in the 900 range, 9 to 1,000, depending on, do we see stacked boxes? Do we don't? So the thing about James Robinson is I definitely think that he could end up being a really good value. He is a guy that if you're kind of getting into that third round, that's where we're going to start taking James Robinson, maybe late second, okay? Again, kind of have to redo the rankings a little bit more, have to really see kind of where the ADP currently stood and who he may or not go over. So for me, James Robinson right now, I'm taking him in the third round probably. That's where you're going to have to grab him. We could see him end up going up, into that late second possibly, but it is something we'll have to monitor. But guys, I'm taking him over. I'll take him over a Myles Gaskin now. I'll take him over a Mike Davis. Both of those guys have been must-have running backs for me this season. I will take him over both of those guys now because of the opportunity that we're going to see. I will take him over, some other guys that you may be looking at, like a Damian Harris. I'll take him over a Damian Harris. For me, James Robinson is going to land, again, solely in that high RB2 to mid RB2 range. Maybe some upside, maybe some RB1 upside in a week in which they are winning a little bit more than what we could expect. But the passing attempts and some of the passing work that we just automatically assume would, hey, Travis Etienne's out, it's going to go to James. No, I'm expecting it to go to Laviska Shenault Jr. So Laviska Shenault, to me, is starting to creep up into that wide receiver 3 category. I still have Marvin Jones as my wide receiver 1 on that team, not overall, on that team. Laviska Shenault, to me, is coming in behind him now. Jake loves DJ Chark, and I understand the reasoning behind it. But I was going to go with Marvin Jones instead, and I like Laviska Shenault to be the wide receiver 2 on this team, which only then leaves DJ Chark as the wide receiver 3. DJ Chark, to me, is going to be a guy that's going to have some very explosive games, but I don't think he's going to have the type of volume numbers that we'll see from Shenault now and potentially from Marvin Jones. So that's kind of how that pecking order is playing out for me right now. And for those of you that are in much deeper leagues, Carlos Hyde is worth a little bit of a peek right now, especially if you own James Robinson. I did a video a couple of weeks ago on must-have handcuffs. Carlos Hyde isn't necessarily coming into that territory for me right now, but he is a guy that if you play in a 14 or a 16 team league, if you play in a league that has a whole lot of depth on it, lots of big benches, if you play in a league that, there just wasn't a whole lot of running backs available and maybe you're short on running backs, grab Carlos Hyde and just see how things play out over the next couple of weeks. But again, Laviska Shenault Jr. is a guy that can be used all over the field like he was at Colorado. I'm kind of hoping that they might give him some touches out of the backfield and see what he can do with the ball in his hands. I don't really need to see any more Carlos Hyde. We know what he can do, right? But ladies and gentlemen, there you have it. Kind of a quick breakdown on the Travis Etienne injury, what it means for James Robinson, Laviska Shenault Jr., Trevor Lawrence, this entire team, how it impacts them. But we had to get the video out for you all. Sorry it took so long. You know we love to get these breaking news videos out right away. We just couldn't pull it off today, but glad we were able to nail it right now. If you're new here to the Fantasy Headliners, hit that subscribe button. Like the video if you appreciate the content, and leave me a comment below. Where do you think James Robinson ends up now? Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to get out of here. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I will catch you all on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.